Okay, Curtiss-Wright P-40 and C-46 unsung heroes of World War II, and you know, it's really because you don't hear about them a ton compared to a lot of other aircraft, and I'll touch on that during the talk. Here's a picture of our C-46 and the P-40 right in back of it. It's hard to find a photo of both of them together, but there they are. Uh, I realize I'm talking to the experts here, but I'll just go through Glenn Curtiss really fast. 1878 to 1930, started out on bicycles like the Wright brothers, and then made his own engines and built motorcycles out of them. Entered aviation by supplying engines for Baldwin dirigibles. 1907, Ormond Beach, Florida, on one of his motorcycles with one of his V8 engines, fastest man in the world at 136 miles an hour down the beach. And that's not just a motorcycle record, that's an anything record. Car, motorcycle, train, plane, fastest man in the world at 136 miles per hour. 1907, teamed up with A.G. Bell, that's Alexander Graham Bell, and others to form the Aerial Experiment Association. And the AEA in 1908 won the Scientific American Trophy for the first publicly announced flight of more than 1 kilometer. And there's a picture of Glenn Curtiss flying that in the June bug at Hammondsport in 1908. Now, the Wright brothers actually, by 1908, were building considerably more capable aircraft than this. But their flights did not qualify for the Scientific American Trophy because they weren't announced in advance and open to the public. And even though at this time in 1908 they were more advanced, that did not last for long. Curtiss and many other aircraft manufacturers and designers around the world soon surpassed the Wright brothers. In fact, there's a saying that there's no question that the Wright brothers built the first airplane, but they never really figured out how to build the second airplane. 1909, Curtiss goes to France and he wins the Gordon Bennett Cup against top aviators in the world, flying a biplane of his own design. A lot of us, when we were kids, I know I read a lot of Tom Swift books, although when I was a kid, it was by the son of the original author. But back in 1910, with the original series, some speculated that Tom Swift and his motorcycle and Tom Swift and his airship, that Tom Swift was actually based on Glenn Curtiss. A little more on his airplanes, 1910 and 1911. Curtiss aircraft, he wasn't flying. It was one of his pilots, Eugene Ely, did the first aircraft to take off and land from a ship. It was a Navy cruiser, first on the East Coast and then on the West Coast. 1911, the first seaplane. For both of these reasons, Glenn Curtiss is sometimes considered the father of naval aviation. 1919, a Curtiss NC-4 is the first aircraft to cross the Atlantic. And in fact, by the end of World War I, the Curtiss Airplane and Motor Company in Buffalo is the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. And that's primarily by virtue of all the Curtiss Jennies that they made. And in fact, I gave a talk to this group on the Jenny a year or so ago. Some of you who are here now probably sat in on that. 1920, Glenn Curtiss leaves the company. 1930, he dies in Buffalo of complications of appendicitis. But meanwhile, his company lived on, merged with the Wright Aircraft Company to form Curtiss-Wright. And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the talk. For those of you who have never been there, there's the Glenn Curtiss Museum along Route 54 on the way to Hammondsport. And there is Glenn Curtiss's grave in the cemetery right down the road from the museum. And if you've never been there, I would urge you to go. I mean, to think that possibly you can argue that he was just as important as the Wright brothers in early aviation. And to think he's buried right here in our backyard, there's his large gravestone. There's a commemorative plaque right next to it talking about many of his firsts. And my wife and I go to Hammondsport a number of times over the course of the summer, and at least once and often twice per year, we stop at Mr. Curtiss's grave and pay our respects. So moving on, Curtiss started building airplanes in Hammondsport, but when he started to get big contracts from the Army for the JN-4 Jenny, he moved to Buffalo because he didn't have the manpower or the room in Hammondsport. Originally, he was a factory on Churchill Street, moved up to a factory on Elmwood Avenue to make the Jennies and the flying boats. And in fact, that building was still there until 4 or 5 years ago when they finally knocked it down. It was huge. Kenmore Avenue plant starts making the P-36 and then the P-40, and then opens up the big plant on Genesee Street, 1941, where he makes the P-40 and the C-46. And interesting little fact, the P-40s made on Kenmore Avenue, they would be trucked over. They would be mostly complete, and then they would be trucked, partially disassembled over to the airport on Genesee Street for flight test and then delivery to the Army Air Corps or wherever else they were going. And some pilots determined that if the plane had a minimum gas load, just barely enough to do it, and some other things not installed, possibly the machine guns, I'm not sure, that they could actually take off from the parking lot at the Kenmore Avenue plant and fly to the Buffalo Airport for finishing. And once they determined they could do that, that was how they moved all the P-40s rather than doing it by truck. And then, like I said, Genesee Street, 1941, they started making the P-40s there and the C-46. This is not the plant on Genesee Street. This is another plant on Cayuga Road, and it's actually still there. This was in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s when I started working there. This was the Sierra Research Plant in Buffalo. And these hangars over here, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, on the far left, they're actually still used as hangars. In the far left one, there's a company in there now called Executive Airshare. These are a couple of photographs that a friend of mine, I think his mother or a friend of his mother worked in the plant. And these are a couple of photographs inside the plant that are of incredibly high resolution. You know, I don't know what film they were taking with or what resolution they were scanned at, but I'm going to zoom in right here, and you'll be able to read that sign. And actually, boy, if you knew someone here, you could recognize their face. So from that to that, this is an extraordinarily high resolution photo. To me, I'm not a photographic expert for the 40s. So C-46 Commando, here it is. I believe this is one at the Air Force Museum. Of course, you guys have a beautiful one out front of the museum. And here's a little video.
America is building fleets of giant aerial cargo transports, big enough to carry troops and mechanized equipment to the far corners of the world. Called Commandos, the first of the mammoth airliners is tested by the Army.
I'm going to pause it for a second. Can you guys hear the sound? You're all muted.
Yes.
So I assume
Yes.
you could.
Yeah,
Okay. Great. Thank you.
America is building fleets of giant aerial cargo transports, big enough to carry troops and mechanized equipment to the far corners of the world. Called Commandos, the first of the mammoth airliners is tested by the Army. Just how many soldiers it can accommodate is a closely guarded secret of the U.S. Air Force. But this gives you a pretty good idea. Infantry of the air, flying direct to the scene of battle. Inside, they sit on specially built seats with parachutes for their cushions. There's still plenty of room for additional equipment. And here it is, scout cars rolling up the double ramp under their own power, rolling right through doors big enough to admit a tank. Commando's powerful nose points aloft. Her engines, mightier than any ship in commercial service, speeding 25 tons across land and sea as fast as a combat plane. Planes that will change completely the timetables of the world.
And of course, that's a World War II film, bit of propaganda in it. I don't know that you're going to fit much of a tank through that door, but still, it was the largest twin-engine aircraft in the world at the time. Here's another one of those amazing high-resolution photographs. You can see all the planes that are under construction at once in the plant. And again, just to show you the resolution, I'm going to zoom in on this little chart. And you can read it, How Absenteeism Cuts Production. And they show you a couple of lines. So the genesis of the aircraft, Curtiss originally wanted to compete in the airliner business. So it was called the CW-20 airliner. It was pressurized, pretty state-of-the-art. First flight of March 1940. That was actually designed and built in St. Louis, but they didn't sell any of them. And when the Army started to order them, because World War II was about to start, they ordered an unpressurized C-46 version. Actually, it had started May of 42, and over 3,000 C-46s were built in Buffalo in the plant on Genesee Street. Largest twin-engine aircraft in the world at the time. And here's a picture of a C-46. A lot of people, because of the resemblance, figure that it's about the same size and capability as the C-47. And here's a C-47. So you can see they certainly look similar. Of course, the C-46 doesn't have the raked cockpit. It had this smooth nose. But actually, a couple of them, going the wrong way, a couple of them did. This is a XC-46B, the prototype for the C-46B model, and you can see it did have the C-47 like nose, but the vast majority of them had the smoother nose, as does the one in front of the Glenn Curtiss Museum. And if you compare some of these numbers here, you can see it's a vastly more capable aircraft than the C-47. Almost double the empty weight, almost double the payload. That's not payload. That's gross weight. My apologies. It's not. That's a typo. It's not a 26,000 pound payload on the C-47. I updated this chart a couple of days ago and made a mistake there. Wing area is a little bit more, but the wing loading is significantly more. So between the increased area and the increased loading, that gives you the increased gross weight and increased cargo. Cruise speed was about the same, but it could cruise at a higher altitude, which turned out to be very significant in the hump airlift in the China-Burma-India theater. And I'm going to talk to that very briefly. For those of you who are not familiar, the airlift over the hump was the first really major organized airlift that ever was. There were smaller ones before that. In fact, I give a talk on airlift that I could give to you guys sometime. But the hump was the first big organized airlift. And initially they used the C-47, which, as we said, smaller airplane, can't carry as much, can't fly as high. And because of those altitude restrictions, it forced them to fly a more dangerous route that exposed them to the Japanese. So here's a picture of that theater. You have India on the left, you have China on the right, and Burma in the middle, which is why they called it the CBI, for the China-Burma-India Theater. And to go from India on the left to China on the right, the C-47s couldn't fly over the Himalayas, so they had to fly this southern route, which would expose them to the Japanese in the red area. Whereas the C-46s, because of their increased altitude capability, could take this safer northern route. In fact, the majority of the cargo over the hump was flown by the C-46. Most people don't realize that. They think it was the C-47. In fact, a lot of people think most of the cargo flown over the Berlin airlift in 1947 and 48 was flown by the C-47, and it was not. That majority of that cargo was flown by C-54s. So I don't mean to knock the C-47, but it was more of a smaller tactical airlifter, whereas the C-46 was more of a strategic airlifter. And of course, C-47s were used extensively in Europe, especially the invasion of Normandy, to tow gliders and for paratroop drops. The C-46 did have some issues. It was sort of a maintenance beast. They had some problems with engines catching fire, but eventually they got rid of those problems. And there was no other aircraft available with that capability. And without it, they may have lost that front. You know, the India and the Chinese might have been pushed out by the Japanese. And of course, General William Tunner commanded the hump airlift, and that was really where he cut his teeth. He eventually commanded the Berlin airlift in 47 and 48. And the Berlin airlift was the first major confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And if that wasn't successful, who knows, really, who knows where the world would be today. These are some personal photos. My wife and I, a year ago, we went up to the Northwest Territories in Canada to see the Northern Lights. And there's an outfit up there, Buffalo Airways, that still has and flies two C-46s. People have told me they're featured on a TV show. I think maybe it's called Ice Pilots. I'm not sure. I've never seen it. But we were driving around the airport, and this is one of their C-46s, which doesn't look too good. You can see there's no prop on the engine, if the engine is there at all. Maybe it's not. But here's another one. This is one that they're actually flying all the time on the Yellowknife Airport. I actually snuck in and snapped this photo right before I was chased away by an employee of Buffalo Airways. But then I gave them a call and I asked if I could get a tour, and they eventually said yes. And here's another picture of me with a safety vest on, closer to the airplane. I got to speak to several pilots about the plane. I said, why do you fly these airplanes? And they said, we fly them because it is economical for us to do so. We couldn't get anything else for this amount of money to fly this amount of cargo in this region this efficiently. So 1942 to 2024, over 80 years later, the Curtiss-Wright C-46 is still flying up in the Canadian Arctic. So let's move on to the P-40 Warhawk. Here's a picture of three P-40s in formation. Beautiful, beautiful airplane. Here's a video about that.
Another record for American aviation. Test pilot Bob Fossell is going aloft in a Curtiss P-40 Standard Army pursuit ship for a crack at the speed record. And brother, he does, and how. Last year, an Army plane hit 620 miles an hour in a vertical power dive. Fossell exceeds that by over 40 miles an hour. 661 miles per hour. Tribute to Yankee engineering and production. Best in the world. And to test pilot Bob Fossell.
Okay. Not really sure that he went 660 miles per hour. That's pretty darn fast, but nevertheless, a hell of a power dive. But before Curtiss-Wright made the P-40, in fact, well before they made the P-40, this was representative of the monoplanes that they were cranking out, which doesn't look like a very modern airplane. In 1932, the Curtiss P-394 Swift. But meanwhile, in 1932, Don Berlin is working for Northrop, and he designs the Northrop Gamma racing aircraft. So, combine that compared to that. And I think the Curtiss-Wright folks took a look at that and they said, we need Don Berlin. So they hired him as their chief designer in Buffalo. And soon after, in 1935, he makes this civilian aircraft, the Hawk Model 75. And you can see, take a close look at it, retractable landing gear, looks very civilian, but with minor modifications. A year later, they put in a bigger engine in the front, actually looks quite a bit like a P-47, and made the YP-36 Hawk. 1937, the Army orders 210 Hawks. War clouds are gathering in Europe. They export a bunch of them to Britain, France, and China. And it was actually a significant British fighter in North Africa at the beginning of the war. They were employing quite a few P-36s. It was slower than the Messerschmitt 109s it was facing, but more maneuverable, particularly at low altitudes, and if hit, could absorb more punishment. 1938, the 10th production P-36 is fitted with a liquid-cooled V12 engine to create the XP-40. So believe it or not, this is the first P-40. You'll notice the inlet for radiator cooling is behind and underneath the fuselage, behind the cockpit, much like the P-51, and save that thought for later. In fact, it looks quite a bit like a P-51. But believe it or not, from the firewall back, except for the radiator, this is a P-36. They converted a P-36 on the production line into the P-40 prototype. So you say, well, gee, that doesn't look like this. This is, this is what we're used to seeing with the shark teeth, our Flying Tigers P-40. And it did evolve into that. So here's the first prototype, Rev 0. This is the same airplane with now the radiator and the radiator inlet moved forward where we're used to seeing it, but it's still quite small. Here's the P-40B starting to look a lot more like a P-40. You can see the radiator inlet, and that section is now bigger. And then here's a P-40F, in this case, one operated by the Royal Air Force at Kitty Hawk. And this is our standard P-40 that all of us grew to know and love when we were kids. So let's talk about the engines. The P-36 had a 1,200 horsepower radial. It could go 325 miles per hour top speed. The P-40 prototype had a slightly less powerful engine, but because it was more streamlined, it could match that speed. And then as I'm not sure why the P-40B could go faster with ostensibly a less horsepower engine, but then the definitive one, the P-40F, 1,240 horsepower, could go 370 miles per hour. In fact, I'm going to have to look into this between the XP-40 and the P-40B, the difference in performance. From 1940 to 1944, Curtiss-Wright in Buffalo manufactured almost 14,000 P-40s. And one of the reasons they were able to do that is because when they converted from making P-36s to P-40s, they didn't have to make a lot of changes to the production line. As I said, from the firewall back, it was the same aircraft. And here's a picture again of the P-36. And it's hard to believe because the fuselage looks a lot bigger, but from here back, it's the same as the P-40. Okay, so again, and I'm sorry I refer to most of us, but I sense most of you are about my age. We grew up, the P-51, the P-47, the P-38, those were the big fighters that won World War II for the U.S. But in fact, the P-40 was the core of the U.S. Army Air Corps fighter force until mid-1943. So let's talk about that a little more. In 1940, Curtiss built over 1,200 P-36s and P-40s, all by itself in Buffalo. Total fighters built by all other Army fighters here, not Grumman, Navy fighters. Total built by all other U.S. manufacturers in the U.S. that same year, 152. 152. 1941, Curtiss built over 2,000 P-40s, and Bell in Niagara Falls built almost 1,000 P-39s. So in 1949, Curtiss-Wright and Bell in Buffalo built 3,172 fighter aircraft for the U.S. Army Air Corps. All the rest of the aircraft manufacturers in the country, 609. 609. So Pearl Harbor was December 7th. When the U.S. went to war, the Army Air Corps in World War II, what do you think they're flying? Mostly P-40s and some P-39s, all built in Buffalo. In fact, by August 43, more than half of the U.S. Army Air Force fighters overseas were still P-39s and P-40s. So yes, I don't mean to knock the P-51 and the P-47 and the P-38, but by the time those aircraft got to the U.S. Army in any numbers, I would say the tide of the war had turned. The tide of the war had turned. In fact, this is a quote from an Army Air Corps officer around that time. If we had not had the P-40, we would not have had any pursuit. Total production of those aircraft by war's end, P-40, again, almost 14,000. P-51, which eventually ramped up quite a bit, a little over 14,000. And the P-47 was the most widely produced U.S. fighter in the war, 15,683. 9,000 of those P-40s were employed by the United States in the Pacific, North Africa, and Europe. We gave quite a few to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and they employed them on the Eastern Front in Europe. And the British Commonwealth, the Royal Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force, they employed over 1,700 P-40s in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. And I just finished, I'm going on a Nevil Shute binge. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's the author that wrote On the Beach and many other novels, and I'm kind of binging on Nevil Shute novels in the past month or so. And I just finished one called Pastoral, and it talked about the employment of the P-40 with the Royal Air Force in Africa. And I have a passage here that I'm going to read to you. And this is from a fiction novel, Pastoral, but it is, of course, based on fact. And it says the Royal Air Force have been magnificent all through. This is a brigadier general writing home to his mother. We should never have got through the wadis except for their help. They laid what Tedder calls a carpet for us all day, over and over again. They came down to ground level ahead of us, shooting up everything they saw resisting the advance and bombing all the anti-tank positions. It was magnificent, but it was very costly to them because the Germans had plenty of light flak. Over and over again, in the last few days, we have found crashed Hurricanes and Kitty Hawks, which is what the Brits called the P-40. We have found crashed Hurricanes and Kitty Hawks in our advance, scores of them, some with the body of the pilot still in the seat. The Germans are resisting desperately, but if we get through, it will be because of what these Air Force boys are doing to prepare the ground ahead of us with their self-sacrifice. And that's from Pastoral by Nevil Shute. Terrific book if you ever want to escape into a World War II novel. Okay, now let's talk about the P-51. Some people say, and I don't know if you all out there have heard this, that the P-51 actually, that they got a lot of that design from Curtiss-Wright. So let's look into that a little bit. The origins of the P-51, of many of you are probably aware, was not for a U.S. requirement. It was for the British Purchasing Commission. They couldn't get enough P-40s, so they went to North American in California and they said, hey, can you build the P-40 for us under license? And North American said, well, we can, but since we have to set up a production line from scratch, we think we can build our own airplane that hopefully would be a little bit better. So they said, okay, you can do that. So this is a letter from North American to the Brits, and I'm going to blow up this area here. And it says, we have reached an extremely satisfactory agreement with the Curtiss Airplane Company of Buffalo, where they are furnishing to us data covering a comprehensive series of wind tunnel cooling and performance tests of a similar airplane, which data will assist us in the design and manufacture of these airplanes. Is this a smoking gun? The similar airplane was actually the P-46, which Curtiss was going to build as a follow-on to the P-40. So here's a picture of the first P-51, the P-51A. This is the Curtiss XP-46, which was designed to replace the P-40. And they're pretty similar. They're pretty similar. I'm going to flip back to the P-51. A significant characteristic of the P-51 is this radiator here underneath with a little exhaust scoop, And what this radiator actually did, it employed something called the Meredith effect, which essentially turned the radiator into a little ramjet. So when the air came in the front of the radiator to cool the engine cooling fluid, the way it went through the radiator, it was actually heated up and expelled in such a way that it generated thrust. And it wasn't really enough thrust where you'd say it contributed to the engine's thrust, but it was enough thrust that it canceled the drag of the radiator, which in and of itself is quite significant. In fact, a lot of people attribute the extreme range of the P-51 when it was able to escort the B-17s over Berlin in World War II to the laminar flow wing here, which was an innovative wing. But if you dive into it, the designers of the aircraft actually attribute most of that range to the Meredith effect of the radiator. So here's a P-46, and boy, that radiator looks the same. You know, did it employ the Meredith effect, and did North American get it from them? I don't know. But here's an AIAA meeting. I explained that to some folks at the beginning of the talk, American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics in Buffalo in 2015. And we have actually four very distinguished figures here. This is Bob Brady. He was the recently retired CEO of Moog in Buffalo. This is Renzo Caporali. He retired as the CEO of Grumman in Long Island. And he's considered the father of the F-14. This is John Seneff, a Bell engineer who flew P-47s during World War II. But this gentleman, this is actually why I'm showing you the picture. This is Walt Brewer, age 97, who we are recognizing for 75 years membership in AIAA. And Mr. Brewer was a Curtiss engineer during World War II. And he and I had a long talk about this subject, the P-46 and the P-41. And he said the Mustang was really the P-46 with a laminar wing added and a more square tail and wing shapes. So that's kind of right out of the horse's mouth. I don't know to what extent that's true. You know, the P-46, the first flight was in February 41. Maximum speed was 355 miles an hour at 12,000 feet. The P-51 prototype, actually, the first flight was before the P-46 first flight, and it was a little bit faster and could fly a little bit higher. And then the P-51B going forward, which was the definitive P-51, because it had the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine actually built under license by Packard, which had a two-stage supercharger, and that could achieve 435 miles an hour at 30,000 feet, much higher because of the supercharging. So, did North American copy the P-46 to make the P-51? I don't think so. You know, they may have given them some ideas, but I think they pretty much did it themselves. So there's the P-51. This actually isn't the P-46. This is the P-40 XP-40 prototype in 1938, and you can see that actually looks a lot like the P-51. There's the P-46. So, you know, there's a lot more to designing an airplane than the resemblance. Meanwhile, here's the definitive P-51, the P-51D, 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Curtiss-Wright eventually did build a definitive P-40 with a Merlin engine, the P-40Q. The first flight was in late 1943, 422 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. Performance somewhat comparable to the P-51, but it was just too little too late. First flight of the P-40Q was late 1943. A couple of months later, January 1944, first flight by Lockheed of the XP-80, America's second jet. You know, game over. The Curtiss-Wright is not going to be building any more P-40s. In a sense, Curtiss-Wright was a victim of their own success. The P-40 was so necessary to the Army Air Corps, they wouldn't let them switch to anything else. They could have switched to P-46s and improved them and possibly made the P-46 something like the P-51. But it was so different. It wasn't like the P-36 to the P-40, where it was mostly the same airplane except for the engine. Switching production during the war from the P-40 to the P-46 would have cost them 1,000 aircraft that they wouldn't have been able to build while they were switching it over. And the Army just wouldn't let them do it. They wouldn't let them do it. The massive production of those aircraft also diluted the engineering talent available in Buffalo, which didn't let them work on something newer. And there was also evidence of a conservative design philosophy at Curtiss-Wright that North American and Lockheed, you know, weren't dealing with at that point because they didn't have the history. They didn't have the tremendous history of Curtiss-Wright. So in a sense, their tremendous wartime success probably contributed the most to their downfall. What happened to Curtiss-Wright? VJ Day, victory in Japan in August 90% of their aircraft orders were canceled after that day. August 1945, the Buffalo operation was closed completely. And at the time, they had just started to build a research laboratory with a massive wind tunnel, better than anything else in the rest of the country, an 8 foot across, well, not a very, very good wind tunnel, 8 foot cross section, test section where they would put the aircraft models. And that was called the Curtiss-Wright Research Laboratory. After they closed their operations in Buffalo, they donated that to Cornell University, and the Curtiss-Wright Research Lab became the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory, and it operated in Buffalo for many years as CAL until 1973, when protests at Cornell University against the Vietnam War basically persuaded the administration to divest itself of Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory because the students and many of the faculty didn't want Cornell to have anything to do with the Vietnam War. So Cal became its own private company called CalSpan. And the Cal in CalSpan is the Cal and Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory, and then SPAN, they just added sort of spanning the technologies, and that's where CalSpan came from. So to wrap up, here's a classic photo of World War II fighter aircraft. Left to right, the P-47, the P-38, and the P-51. And I say, where is the P-40? Where is the P-40? Truly an unsung hero of World War II. What happened at Curtiss-Wright? World War I, largest aircraft manufacturer in the world. World War II, second largest defense contractor in the United States. They were in a lot more places than Buffalo. They had plants all over the country. 1948, the Curtiss Airplane Division closed. They stopped making airplanes completely. Curtiss-Wright is still around, but it's sort of like a Moog. They make hydraulic actuators and things like that. They're a component supplier. But when the country called during World War II, Curtiss-Wright answered. And that is the end of my talk. Hope you found it interesting, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk, Walter. Let me see. I can also read questions from the chat as well.
No, I can do that also. Let me see what we got here. Mute their audio. You say the factory was located in Buffalo. What is the significance of having the museum in Hammondsport? You should have heard my Jenny talk. So Glenn Curtiss started his flying operations in Hammondsport. That's where he built the June Bug with the Aerial Experimental Association. That was where he built the Silver Dart. The Silver Dart was a similar biplane to the June Bug that was built in Hammondsport, was boxed up and shipped to Canada, to Nova Scotia, Bedeck, Nova Scotia, where Alexander Graham Bell had a summer home. And it was actually flown in Canada, this biplane that was built in Hammondsport by a pilot named J.A.D. McCurdy. And it was the first flight of an airplane in Canada was a Curtiss airplane built in Hammondsport. All those biplanes that I talked about, the first to take off and land from an aircraft carrier, were made in Hammondsport, and the Curtiss Jennies that were the most ubiquitous trainer in World War I. 90% of all U.S. and Canadian pilots in World War I learned to fly in a Jenny. The prototypes for the Jenny were all made in Hammondsport. Curtiss did not move to Buffalo until he got these humongous orders for the Jenny, and there weren't enough people in Hammondsport to support that manufacturing. So the museum is in Hammondsport because that is where Glenn Curtiss got his start. In fact, his middle name, you'll notice it's the Glenn H. Curtiss Museum. H stands for Hammond. It's Glenn Hammond Curtiss, and that is the same Hammond as in Hammondsport. So that's why the Glenn Curtiss Museum is in Hammondsport. That's where he did all his initial work.
When moving the factory to Hammondsport, so you say it was because they had too many orders, they needed to increase the amount.
Mhm.
How much of that was because of the Wright lawsuits and, Glenn Curtiss doing a little bit of the, the made in America, quote unquote, made in Canada thing to avoid those lawsuits? Because I always find that really cool.
Yeah. Um, I'm not an expert on the lawsuits. I am aware of them, but I don't think that had anything to do with moving from Hammondsport to Buffalo. You know, interestingly though, the Jenny prototypes that Curtiss made uh in Hammondsport, the initial ones, the ailerons were not in the wings. The ailerons were between the wings, like Curtiss had in his biplanes, like he had in the Junebug and like he had in the Silver Dart. And the reason he put them in between the wings was because the Wright's patent, uh, I shouldn't say the Wright's patent, their patent claimed anything that rolled the aircraft uh, in that axis violated their patent. But the way they made it happen on their airplanes was by warping the wings. And Curtiss thought, well, if the control surface that does that is not on the wings, if it's a separate control surface, then I can make the point even more strongly that I'm not violating their patent. But at any rate, when World War I came around, the U.S. government and the military said, "You guys stop fighting. We need you to build planes for the war effort." So once Curtiss started making the Jenny by government order, the patent battle was not a player anymore. Interesting little side note. I'm also an authority is too strong of a word, but I'm an airship fan, and a lot of you are aware of the German Zeppelins that they made during World War I that were used to bomb England from Germany. And in fact, in Germany, there were two competing Zeppelin companies that sued each other because of patents. Two different airship companies. One was Zeppelin, and one was Chutelance. And when World War I broke out, the German government did a very similar thing. They said, look, you're sharing your patents now. You're going to make the best airplanes you can for us. Stop fighting. So I find it very interesting that something so similar happened in both the US and in Germany. Long answer to a short question, my apologies. But I don't think moving to Buffalo had anything to do with the patent fight. Howard,
Uh,
thank you very
Anything
much.
to do with
Roger, I'm
I
sorry,
had,
go ahead.
oh, yeah. I had read that, they put it, I had read that I was told by a few other people, including like our curator in the museum, that
Mhm.
it I don't know if it was completely that or like they had agreed to it, but part of the reason why Glenn moved the factory to Buffalo is because it was closer to Canada. What he'd do is because those bolts on the roots of the wings, he'd manufacture the wings and the fuselage separately, ship them over separately to Canada, and then bolt on the wings and call it Canadian-made planes, so he didn't have to pay the Wright brothers a fine
Hmm.
whenever he made a plane.
Yeah, I'll talk to your curator about it. I've never heard.
Yeah.
Um, Point of fact, though, in fact, I never even heard about. I'd be surprised if parts of the Jennies that were built in Buffalo were sent over to Canada and sent back. But
Yeah.
it's possible. I'm not saying it's not. It would just surprise me. But actually, quite a few Jennies were made in Canada. So I don't know if there's any chance they're thinking of that. 5, 6, 700 Jennies were actually made in the Toronto area.
Well, I think they were normal Jennies. I don't think that they're the Canuck ones that had the extra ailerons on the wings. I think the Canuck
Well,
ones were a
no, by
bit
the
deeper in
time by the
Canada.
time it went to Buffalo, all the ailerons were in the wings. There was no aileron in between the wing anymore.
Oh no, I'm saying like the special Canadian contract one. Instead of having ailerons on either the top, like a pair of ailerons on either the top set of wings or the lower set of wings, it
Hmm.
had two pairs of ailerons on both sets of the wings.
Hmm.
Concerning the
Uh,
Ham,
question?
concerning the Hammondsport location, there's another detail here. Um, Curtiss did basically all of his early development of flying boats there on Cuca Lake.
sure.
So it only makes sense for Curtiss Museum to be based there because the whole idea of the flying boat is Cuca Lake.
Yep. Yep. Couldn't agree more with that. Um, and
In
also
fact, an old
when
an old family album that my I I swear my brother has, and he's not aware of it. There is a photo looking out from the family place, the Elms, I think it was, looking out onto Keuka Lake, and there's a Curtiss flying boat skittering by right over the top of the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, when Curtiss, rewickered the Langley Aerodrome and flew that in Hammondsport, that was off the ice on Curtis Lake, flown by Gink Doherty, the great grandfather of a past executive director of the Glenn Curtiss Museum. Okay, going down the questions. Great talk. Was there a connection between the Bell and the Curtiss plants in Buffalo? No, none whatsoever that I am aware of.
Question. I recollect that, don't you have a P-40 at the Hammondsport that you're rebuilding?
I'll let Andre answer that. I know there's one, but I'm not a Curtiss Museum guy.
I can speak to that because I've been involved in some of the tweaks that have been done. The P-40 is in the back part of the museum, the separate building.
Yeah.
It's not going to be moved anytime soon. The plan, and Andre can speak to this, the plan is that part of that workshop space will be converted to exhibit space for, it's currently available for people to walk in, but you can't really go up to the P-40 itself. And so the idea is that it'll be made so that the people can actually walk up to the P-40.
Mm-hmm.
How is that rebuild going?
Oh, the airplane is virtually complete, except the gear retraction mechanism is missing the appropriate gears in it to be able to. So the airplane is supported on supports from under the two wings and the tail, but and supposedly the people at Cornell are scanning from are manufacturing the replacement to the gear based on the drawings for it, but we haven't seen that yet.
This is Roger. I talked to the curator last Saturday, and the gear's complete, so they actually installed it. But when they were working on the airplane, they created some kind of reinforcement for the aircraft when they were working on it, and there's some kind of problem with the gear in its place now that they can't put the full weight on the landing gear for some reason. I'm not sure what that is. So right now they can't lower the airplane to put it on its own wheels in order to move it. So they will have to figure out a way to move it while it's still on the blocks. And
it's going to be fun.
I'm sure it will.
Yeah. I do have one question. You were regarding the flights over the hump. The DC-2 was known as an airplane that was capable of carrying more ice than the DC-3. Of course, the DC-3 is the civilian version of what became the C-47. Do you know whether the C-46 was a better, an airplane that was better in icing conditions than the C-47?
That's a great question. I have no idea. I would have assumed they both have boots, but I don't actually know. That's not anything I looked into.
Of course, that was one of the prime dangers for anybody flying the hump was the icing conditions.
Icing, bad navigation, elevation. They called the route I think it was the aluminum highway. It was the aluminum something or other because
right. I remember that. Yeah.
All the wrecked airplanes across it.
A couple of other points. The Junebug had what they called horizontal rudders that were actually in the wingtips. So they were in the plane as the Wright brother, the Wright brother patent reads any control system in the plane. And I was doing a tour at the Curtiss Museum, and I was explaining about the Albany Flyer or Hudson Flyer, whichever one you want to call it, which of course has the roll control between the planes. And I was aware that that was an attempt to get around the Wright patent. And one of my visitors was a patent attorney. Huh? And he said, yeah, there's an element of patent law that says you can't simply relocate an invention to a different place and call it a new invention.
Mhm.
So even though that was one of Curtiss's attempts to get around the right patent, it failed
Mhm.
because patent law kind of covers that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's interesting that you had that guy coming through.
Yeah, I'm also a docent at the National Air and Space Museum, and we get some very qualified people in there as visitors. So I learned something from them just about every tour.
Mhm.
We still think that we're the first ones.
Uh, any other questions? Any other discussion?
Oh, I should mention, because of what Rick was asking about our P-40 museum, I should specify our P-40 is a P-40N. I don't really know too much about their contributions to the war as a whole. I think the earlier versions of the P-40s are a bit more of the famous ones because of their Pearl Harbor and the Flying Tigers being early in the war. I believe the P-40M was used in the defense of India, but I don't really know much outside of that. I don't know if you, Walter, know more about the specific variants and what they've done or not, but ours is the last variant they ever made.
Okay. And yours was recovered from Florida, right? It crashed in Florida, if
Yeah.
I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, in a swamp near Gainesville.
Yeah,
That was in 45.
yeah.
Mid-air collision.
Oh,
Yeah, the two pilots collided on training mission. I believe it was the pilot in Curtiss Museum's P-47 was killed, but the other pilot survived.
yeah.
Ooh. Barbara Sweet asks, has the museum made contact with West Point for a field trip? There's a congressman who was a helicopter pilot in the early part of the Iraq War.
I'll defer that to people associated with the Glenn Curtiss Museum.
Yeah, I don't believe we have. I'm relatively new to the museum, so I'm not sure if that was something we've been discussing potentially like in the past or not, but it hasn't come up with me.
Yeah. Okay. And Janet, I see your request here to send you an email. I will do that. See if I can copy it and paste it in an email. While we're at a very quick lull, and I don't want to keep anyone later, Brian Shoemaker, did you have a relative who flew F-4s in the 107th in Niagara Falls?
That's possible, but I wouldn't necessarily know about it. I mean, my family, branches of the family were from the Elmira area and could very easily have been a distant relative, but I'm not aware of that. My father went to the Naval Academy and flew Grumman's.
Oh, okay. I was in the 107th for a while, and I remember there was a Shoemaker in the unit. I don't remember his first name. It's not a super common name.
It's relatively common in the Elmira Corning area.
Ah, interesting. Yeah. Okay, Janet R., I sent you an email.
All righty. Does anyone have any more questions before we end the meeting? We're gonna go 5, 4, we're gonna count down. All righty. I suppose it's it for tonight. Thank you so much, Walter, for doing the presentation. So sorry we had to get off to such a late start. But thank you everyone who helped out with the lecture recording. I believe, Alan, it was you who was recording it. I can post my email real quick in the chat. If you'd like to send that to me, I'd really appreciate it. So I can get this post on YouTube for anyone who couldn't make it tonight.
Yeah, no, I got your email already.
Oh,
I
perfect.
was the guy that was a reenactor, just talking to you guys earlier this week via email. So
Oh, let me think. Oh, yeah, I remember that email.
yeah, so I'll
All
send it
right.
over to you.
Yeah, wonderful. I think